There is a statement that has echoed through generations, repeated in teachings, spoken in moments of reflection, and yet still remains largely misunderstood in its full depth. What you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. At first glance, it may appear as a poetic expression, or a symbolic idea meant to inspire faith. But beneath the surface lies something far more profound, a revelation of authority that connects the visible world with the unseen realm in a continuous and living alignment. This is not a distant principle reserved for special moments or specific individuals. It is a truth that speaks to the structure of reality itself, where what happens in the physical is not isolated, but connected to a higher order of agreement and response. Nothing exists in complete separation. Everything is part of a flow, a system of alignment where actions, decisions, and declarations carry influence beyond what is immediately seen. For many, life feels like a series of unpredictable events, moments of struggle followed by brief relief, cycles of challenge that seem to repeat without explanation, and circumstances that appear to arrive without permission. This creates a mindset of reaction, where life is something that must be endured, rather than understood or influenced. It feels as though external forces hold the dominant position, while personal influence remains limited or secondary. But the moment this truth is deeply grasped, that entire perspective begins to shift. It becomes clear that life is not merely something happening randomly, it is responding. There is a structure beneath the surface, and within that structure, authority plays a defining role. What is allowed, what is restricted, and what is established is not purely accidental. There is a correspondence between what is declared and what is manifested, between what is permitted and what continues. This realization introduces a completely different way of seeing everything. It moves the mind away from helpless observation and into active awareness. It reveals that silence is not neutral, that inaction is not without consequence, and that every moment carries weight in shaping outcomes. What is left unchallenged does not disappear. It remains and continues. What is ignored does not weaken, it grows in the absence of resistance. This is where the concept of binding begins to carry meaning beyond words. It is not simply about restriction. It is about authority that recognizes what should not continue and makes a decisive declaration that it will no longer operate freely. It is the understanding that permission is not automatic, and that continuation is not guaranteed unless it is allowed. At a deeper level, this truth reveals that influence is not one-directional. It is not only about responding to life, but about life responding in return. There is an interaction between what is established here and what is reflected beyond what can be seen. This interaction is constant, subtle, and deeply significant. Because of this, nothing can truly be considered insignificant. Every thought carries direction. Every word carries weight. Every decision contributes to what is being reinforced or removed. The unseen does not ignore what happens in the seen. It responds in alignment with it. This creates a continuous flow where awareness becomes essential and understanding becomes power. This is the point where everything begins to shift internally. The sense of limitation starts to weaken. The belief that everything is fixed begins to dissolve. In its place grows a recognition that there is a level of authority that has been present all along, waiting not to be discovered as something new, but to be understood and activated as something already given. And once this awareness takes root, it changes the way everything is approached. Life is no longer seen as purely reactive. It becomes something that can be engaged with intentionally, something that responds to alignment, something that responds to alignment, something that reflects what is established within it. This is the hidden authority, not loud, not forced, but deeply influential. And the moment it is grasped, everything begins to shift from uncertainty to clarity, from reaction to direction, and from limitation into awareness of influence that was always present, but never fully recognized. Once the reality of authority is understood, the meaning of binding becomes far more than a concept. It becomes a decisive function of control over what is allowed to continue. Binding is the moment where permission is consciously withdrawn from anything that does not align with peace, clarity, or order. It is the recognition that not everything that persists deserves to persist, and not everything that repeats deserves to remain in motion. There are patterns in life that survive not because they are unchangeable, but because they are uninterrupted. They continue because no resistance has been placed against them, no boundary has been drawn, and no authority has been exercised to stop them. In this way, Repetition can often be mistaken for permanence, but repetition is not proof of strength. It is often proof of absence of restriction. Binding interrupts that cycle. It steps directly into what has been running unchecked and brings it to a point of limitation. It does not negotiate with what is harmful, and it does not tolerate what is misaligned. Instead, it draws a clear and intentional line that says what has been operating freely will no longer continue in the same way. This is not an emotional reaction. It is not driven by temporary frustration or momentary discomfort. True binding is rooted in clarity. It sees what is happening, understands what it produces, and makes a firm decision that continuation is no longer acceptable. That decision alone carries weight because it changes the direction of what was once automatic. Many struggles persist simply because they were never addressed at the level of authority. They were managed, ignored, or endured, but not stopped, and what is not stopped continues to operate within the space it has been given. Binding changes that dynamic entirely. It removes the allowance that has been silently sustaining the issue. There is also precision in this act. Binding is not vague or generalized. It is specific. It identifies exactly what is out of alignment and directly addresses it without confusion. It does not leave room for interpretation or gradual weakening. It is a clear declaration that establishes limits where none previously existed. Once that limit is established, the nature of what is bound begins to change. What once operated freely begins to lose access. What once moved without resistance begins to encounter restriction. What once felt dominant begins to weaken under the weight of authority that now opposes it. This shift does not always appear dramatic at first, but it is foundational because what is bound no longer holds the same freedom to influence, to grow, or to repeat itself in the same way. Its structure has been disrupted, its continuity has been challenged, its permission has been revoked, and as this continues, awareness begins to sharpen. It becomes clearer that not everything deserves space, not everything deserves tolerance, not everything deserves repetition. Simply because it has become familiar, familiarity does not equal validity, and duration does not equal legitimacy. Binding restores that clarity. It separates what is acceptable from what is not based on emotion, but based on alignment. It brings order where there was unchallenged repetition. It brings structure where there was unchecked continuation, and it brings authority where there was previously passivity. In this way, binding is not just about stopping something. It is about reclaiming control over what is allowed to shape experience. It is about refusing to let unexamined patterns dictate direction any longer. And once that refusal is established with clarity, the cycle begins to break. What once felt continuous begins to lose its hold. What once seemed unmovable begins to shift, not because it was never strong, but because it was finally confronted with authority that no longer permits it to continue unchanged. As binding creates boundaries and stops what should not continue, another dimension of authority becomes equally essential: loosing. Without this, authority remains incomplete, because life is not only about stopping what is wrong, but also about activating what is right, what is aligned, and what is meant to flow but has been restricted for too long. Loosing is the intentional release of what has been held back, delayed, or suppressed. It is the moment where permission is given for peace, clarity, strength, and restoration to enter and operate freely. It is not passive waiting for things to improve on their own. It is active declaration that what is good is no longer restricted, and what is needed is no longer blocked. In many situations, what feels like lack is not always absence. It is often restriction. What feels like delay is not always denial. It is often the lack of release. There are outcomes, opportunities, and states of peace that already exist in potential, but remain unseen in experience because they have not been fully loosed into expression. Loosing changes that condition by removing limitation from what is meant to move forward. This is why loosing carries as much authority as binding. If binding closes doors that should not remain open, loosing opens doors that should not remain closed. It restores balance by ensuring that life is not only defined by restriction, but also by expansion. Without loosing, removal creates emptiness, but with loosing, that emptiness is filled with direction, stability, and alignment. Loosing is not random allowance. It is intentional activation. It is a clear decision that what aligns with truth, peace, and order is now permitted to flow without resistance. It gives structure to growth, direction to progress, and stability to what was previously uncertain or delayed. When loosing is applied, something begins to shift internally first. There is a sense of movement where stagnation once existed. There is clarity where confusion once dominated. There is a quiet unfolding of what had been waiting beneath the surface. It may not always appear instantly in external form, but its activation begins immediately in principle. This is because loosing does not simply change circumstances. It changes permission. And when permission changes, expression eventually follows. What was once blocked begins to move. What was once delayed begins to progress. What was once distant begins to draw closer, not by force but by alignment. There is also wisdom in what is released. Loosing is not careless or undefined. It is directed. It is intentional. It focuses on what brings strength, what restores balance, and what supports growth. It does not release confusion or chaos. It releases order, clarity, and peace into their rightful place. Over time, this creates a noticeable transformation in how life unfolds. Instead of constant restriction, there is flow. Instead of repeated blockage, there is movement. Instead of unresolved delay, there is unfolding progression. The atmosphere of life begins to change because what is allowed to excess within it has changed. Loosing also brings confidence into expectation, not passive waiting, but an assured understanding that what has been released is already in motion. Even if it is not immediately visible, it is no longer withheld. It is no longer restricted. It is already working its way into reality. This creates a sense of stability within uncertainty, because even when outcomes are not yet seen, there is awareness that the direction has already been set. What needed to be released has been released. What needed to be activated has been activated. What needed permission now has it. In this way, losing becomes a force of restoration. It rebuilds what restriction weakened. It reactivates what delay suppressed. It restores movement where stagnation once held control. And together with binding, it completes the structure of authority, removing what should not remain, and releasing what should no longer be held back. When the principle of binding and loosing is no longer just heard but truly understood, something begins to shift at the deepest level of perception. It is not merely a change in belief, but a transformation in awareness. Life is no longer interpreted as random sequence or uncontrolled flow, but as something that responds to alignment, intention, and authority. This understanding does not make life instantly easy, but it makes life significantly clearer. Confusion begins to lose its dominance. Situations that once felt overwhelming begin to feel structured and understandable. Instead of reacting emotionally to everything that happens, there is a growing sense of discernment, an ability to recognize what is allowed, what is not, what should be stopped, and what should be released. One of the first inner shifts is the disappearance of helpless thinking. The mindset that once assumed nothing could change begins to weaken. In its place grows a quiet, but firm awareness that change is not only possible, but already accessible through alignment with truth and authority. This awareness does not depend on external validation. It is rooted in understanding. Another transformation appears in the way pressure is interpreted. What once felt like permanent burden begins to reveal itself as something subject to change. Situations are no longer seen as fixed sentences, but as conditions that can be addressed with clarity and intention. This reduces inner panic and replaces it with grounded awareness. As this understanding deepens, emotional instability begins to lose its grip. The mind becomes less reactive and more centered. Instead of being pulled in multiple directions by every circumstance, there is a growing ability to remain steady. This stability does not come from denial of reality, but from recognition that reality is not final when authority is understood. There is also a shift in the relationship with time. Delays no longer feel like absolute loss. Waiting is no longer interpreted as abandonment or failure. Instead, time begins to be seen as part of a process that responds to alignment. This perspective removes unnecessary frustration and replaces it with patience rooted in understanding, rather than confusion. Internally, there is also a reduction in mental noise. When authority is misunderstood, the mind constantly questions, doubts, and overanalyzes. But when authority is recognized, clarity begins to replace that noise. Decisions become more direct. Thinking becomes more focused. Energy is no longer scattered across fear-driven speculation. A deeper awareness also develops regarding responsibility. Instead of placing all outcomes on external forces, there is recognition that participation matters. Not in a burdensome way, but in an empowering way. It becomes clear that presence Awareness and alignment L contribute to direction and outcome. This leads to a subtle but powerful increase in confidence, not the kind that is based on circumstances, but the kind that is based on understanding. Even when situations are uncertain, there is an inner stability that does not collapse easily. That stability comes from knowing that authority is not absent, and alignment is not meaningless. Over time, this transformation affects perception itself. The same situation that once looked impossible begins to look manageable. The same pattern that once looked permanent begins to look interruptible. The same delay that once felt final begins to feel temporary. Nothing necessarily changes immediately outside, but everything begins to change inside, and that inner change is the foundation of everything else. Because once perception shifts, response shifts, and once response shifts, outcomes begin to follow. This is the quiet but powerful effect of truly grasping authority. It does not create noise. It creates clarity. It does not produce chaos. It produces structure. It does not overwhelm the mind. It centers it. And from that centered place, everything begins to be seen differently, not as fixed destiny, but as a reality that responds to understanding, alignment, and the proper exercise of authority. This understanding is not meant to remain as information stored in the mind. It is meant to become a way of living, a daily posture, a continuous awareness that shapes how every situation is approached. Authority loses its impact when it is forgotten, but it becomes powerful when it is consistently exercised with clarity and intention. Every day presents moments where something must be stopped and something must be released, not as a dramatic ritual, but as a steady alignment with truth. There are thoughts that attempt to dominate without permission. There are patterns that try to repeat why without challenge. There are also opportunities for peace, clarity, and progress that must be consciously allowed to flow without resistance. Walking in this authority begins with awareness of what is operating in thought, in emotion, and in circumstance. Nothing is too small to notice because even the smallest unchecked pattern can grow over time. And nothing is too large to address because authority is not limited by size. It is defined by alignment. This daily walk is not about striving harder, but about becoming more precise in recognition. It is about identifying what does not belong and refusing to give it continuation. It is about identifying what is meant to grow and giving it permission to expand without resistance. Consistency is what transforms understanding into experience. A single moment of clarity is powerful, but repeated alignment is what shapes reality over time. Each day becomes an opportunity to reinforce what is true and remove what is not aligned. In this consistency, transformation becomes inevitable. There will always be resistance in the form of doubt, delay, or distraction. But authority is not weakened by resistance. It is revealed through it. Every moment of challenge becomes an opportunity to reaffirm what is already understood. Every moment of pressure becomes a reminder to stand firm in clarity rather than confusion. This is not a passive mindset. It is an active position of awareness. It does not wait for life to settle before responding. It responds with clarity so that life begins to settle into alignment. That is the reversal of power that happens when authority is understood and applied. And as this becomes a way of living, a quiet strength begins to develop, not loud or forced, but steady and unshakable. A strength that does not depend on perfect circumstances, but on consistent alignment. A strength that does not collapse under uncertainty, but remains anchored in understanding. Let this truth be carried forward, not as a concept, but as a practice. Let it shape decisions, refine thoughts, and guide responses. Let it be the lens through which everything is viewed, and the standard by which everything is measured. And in every moment, remember this: what is not meant to continue can be stopped, and what is meant to flow can be released. Nothing is beyond the reach of this alignment when it is understood and consistently applied. Now step into this awareness fully. Do not treat it as distant knowledge. Treat it as present authority. Walk in it, live in it, and let every day reflect the clarity of what has been understood. Call to action. If this truth resonates, do not let it remain as a thought. Carry it into your daily life. Speak it with intention, and align your actions with it consistently.